Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anam Rahim. I am the Global Community Organizer with Build Palestine, and I will be your moderator for today. I'd like to start off with a few housekeeping items. Our discussion will be in English, and there's live translation to Arabic. You can access the Arabic recording by pressing the globe icon below on your Zoom screens. الجلسة هاي بلغة إنجليزية والترجمة العربية متوفرة. توجهوا الإشارة الكرة الأرضية واختاروا اللغة العربية. Today's webinar is part of Build Palestine's monthly series called Mobilizing for Gaza. Our goals for these monthly webinars are twofold. One, to come together in community and have the important conversations that help us to meaningfully take action for Gaza. And two, to amplify the work of organizers, leaders, social entrepreneurs, and initiatives that are driving real impact. The session is 1 hour long, and it will be recorded, and we'll share it with everyone who is registered today. There will also be a recap email sent afterwards with relevant resources and links shared. We want this to be a conversation, so please engage in the chat, share links, and discuss what resonates. And if there's a question you want the panelists to address, please drop that in the Q&A. Time permitting, we'll get to those at the end. We have around 100 people registered today, so please go ahead and say hello, share where you're joining from in the chat. Before we begin, I want to invite you all to take a deep breath and set an intention for this hour. Why are you here, and what do you hope to gain from this conversation? I invite you to join me in a moment of silence for the people of Gaza and all our martyrs who have lost their lives. Thank you, and let's begin. Today's discussion is an exploration of what it means to speak truth to power. Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza has thrust us into a propaganda war, where language has been weaponized by the media and Western governments to suppress truth and delegitimize the Palestinian liberation struggle. Even humanitarian aid organizations shy away from stating straightforward facts, like naming what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. Instead, they opt for apolitical euphemisms such as humanitarian crisis or terms like war or conflict that conceal the disproportionate power dynamics at play. Without naming root causes, without centering truth, genuine progress in Palestine becomes undermined and the violent status quo of occupation becomes normalized. Calling what's happening in Gaza a genocide, or for that matter, Israel an apartheid regime, is not a matter of opinion. It is a description of reality. Truth-telling has always been a fundamental part of Palestinian resistance and the broader struggle against imperialism. Language, when used with intention and precision, is a powerful tool and vehicle for resistance. It forms the backbone of advocacy that shifts the status quo. This is why Israel systematically assassinates Palestinian journalists, writers, and intellectuals. From Ghassan Kanafani to Bassel al-Araj to Rifat Arir, Allah yarhamhum, in all eras of Palestine's struggle, truth bearers have paid the ultimate price. We gather and speak today in their honor to continue their work. In a movement where we are up against powerful and wealthy lobbyists, politicians, and corporations, where our power is truly people power, the work to empower allies to become advocates of the truth is more urgent than ever. In a time where misinformation, falsehoods, and outright lies are enabling death and destruction of staggering proportions in Gaza, it's imperative that we seek, uplift, and learn from leaders that do the courageous work of speaking truth to power and are actively guiding allies to follow suit. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Inas Abdelrazak is an advocate for Palestine internationally, who has spent the majority of her life between Palestine and France. She is co-director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, PIPD, which is a non-governmental independent organization based in Palestine advocating for the liberation of Palestine and from all forms of colonialism, and dedicated to strengthening the Palestinian people's diplomacy necessary to advance freedom and justice. Inas is also a policy member at the Palestinian Policy Network Al-Shabaka and a board member of Build Palestine. Welcome, Inas. And our second panelist, Amy Shalan. Amy is director of McCann, a Palestinian-led organization providing transformative education to strengthen the movement for Palestinian liberation. Amy is also the chair of the British Palestinian Committee, an independent advocacy organization working to ensure British Palestinian voices are integral to public discourse and UK policymaking on Palestine. Welcome, Amy. So let's begin our discussion by centering the importance of centering Palestinian voices in our advocacy work, noting that Palestinians are not a monolith. Let's kick off by discussing the nuances and realities of centering Palestinian voices and how that differs in Palestine and in diaspora. So Inas, you are doing this work on the ground in Palestine. Talk to us about the realities of advocacy under occupation. And when we say we need to center Palestinian voices and perspectives, what do we need to know regarding the realities for Palestinians in Palestine to be speaking out and the resulting hierarchy of which Palestinian voices get heard?
Thank you, Anam, and it's always a pleasure to be in Build Palestine spaces, and I'm happy we're having this important discussion and to be speaking alongside our dear friend Amy. So let me start with this. Obviously, I think one thing we must underline and keep reminding is that Israel is killing our journalists. More than 105 journalists in Gaza have been killed since the beginning of the genocide. We've just passed 2 years of the killing and assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. So this is one aspect that I think we need to keep in mind, because I'm sitting in Ramallah and I have some of the space that obviously our brothers and sisters and people in Gaza don't have. So I think that's the first thing, is that when we're talking about on the ground, there is this forced fragmentation and there are these different realities that we live under. Even from within Palestine, we have very diverse realities. And so I think right now, what's happening is a lot of us who sit in the West Bank are also kind of, compelled to speak for Gaza, although we're not there and we really don't live the same reality. Like, we have much more privileges in a way, even if we live under occupation, and so many hardships, right? So I think that's important to say, because one thing that we need to keep repeating is how Israel is denying the right to inform, denying both the entry of international journalists or killing Palestinians in Gaza who want to speak out. And obviously, since many months, we've seen the importance of Gazans sharing the reality on the ground, but that comes at a very, very high price. They're putting themselves at risk all the time. And obviously, notwithstanding, not even speaking about the technicalities of it, right? A lot of them don't have electricity or ways to charge their phone all the time. Just uploading content, just videos takes really ages. So we've been doing collaborations actually as Rabit. So we're Rabit on social media. And they're amazing, because it takes a lot of energy and courage and just endurance. Instead of focusing on how to survive and find food and get your relatives in a shelter somewhere, they also want to make sure these stories are shared. So that's important. And I think when it comes to the reality in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the rest of Palestine, like in 48, there's also several things I think we need to keep in mind when it comes to centering Palestinian voices. First, I would say me sitting in Palestine, I'm often, I can tell you, probably given much more credibility or platform than someone like Amy who sits in the UK. And I think that's also something we can discuss between what the Western media perceive as, you know, a Palestinian who is kind of legit because they're underground, or a Palestinian who's legit, not legit enough because they're outside. And I think that's wrong. I think that's a dynamic that we see a lot with international media reporting, that they want people on the ground. But I can tell you that sometimes I'm as remote when it comes to the invasion of Jenin refugee camps, because we're a wall away and many checkpoints and many obstacles. So I'm not there, right? I can go there. You know, I've been there last year when there was raids, but it's been a long time I haven't been there. And so when I'm following what's happening in Jenin, it's also the same as someone actually observing from Europe or the US, unfortunately. So I think that also fragmentation, we need to realize it, because we're not all kind of witnessing on the ground what's happening, although we also have army raids in Ramallah. But again, that's a bit of a difference. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And also, I think this idea of who are the voices given legitimacy, who are the voices given platforms. It's true that what you said, like, I think it's so important to center Palestinian voices because we're the first concerned. And I think this is something that's so accepted in many causes. When we talk about, I don't know, domestic violence or violence against women, I think it's now accepted that women should be the ones who are hurt. However, on Palestine, we're still questioned as the ones to be hurt. And I think that's very problematic. And I think this is something we're fighting with editors, with journalists, and kind of explaining to them that we don't need an Israeli next to us to validate our voice. We are experts in our matters. We're not just, either victims or fighters, or that this binary approach where they tend to give the mic to Palestinians to give a testimony of how they feel and how's the situation. But we also, we have many analysts and many people who are the experts on the refugee question, on the question of Palestine, on international law, on what's happening. And I think that's important to also push that we are the ones who know best our situation, and we are the first concerned, so we should be the ones given platform. But as you say, there needs to be a nuance to that. Who's the Palestinian given a platform? There is inherent bias in different ways, that especially now when we're talking about international media, and more specifically Western media, and I know a lot of people are listening today are based in the West. It's about many factors that come into account, like language. They prefer someone who speaks well the English. They of course, if they want someone who speaks French or Spanish, that becomes even more niche. So so they don't always have translators, and I think that's wrong. You should be able to make sure that to get a diversity of Palestinian voices, you invest in making sure that they can speak their own language, they can speak Arabic. The other thing is, often again, they want someone who's like specifically on the ground for the analysis, although it could be someone that's outside for the exact same analysis, because it's a Palestinian who's lived that reality and who can live a reality in exile that's as much Palestinian as someone else. The other thing is, we need to think that we are kind of compelled to become all spokespeople for the Palestinians, because we don't have a unified leadership and we don't have political representation. So, and the political people in power, most Palestinians don't feel they represent them, which means that when it comes to things that are happening, a lot of Palestinians are given the opportunity to, express themselves, become ambassadors for our cause, and so on. And I think that comes with a lot of responsibility in a way, and a lot of burden on many Palestinians, because you're kind of being faced with questions, often gaslighting ones, when it's not necessarily your role, and you're not representing, a unified movement. You're not a politician that's sort of been elected, and you're not the president. And so I think that's a very difficult one. And Hamad El-Kurt has written a really good piece. I think it was in Mobilizing, I'm not sure now, on this. And I think it's an important one to keep into account, because there's also that layer where a lot of the spokespeople then are being asked way more than they can chew. And this happens to some Gaza, influencers on social media, right? So we have a lot of Palestinian voices who make it as influencers on social media. And then they're not allowed any mistakes. They're not allowed to be sort of who they are, a human being with just feelings. And maybe we don't all have the same way to express ourselves, and maybe we don't have the same political thinking. And also, like, they shouldn't be asked to be responding to very sort of, I don't know, analytical framing questions or political questions that they're not comfortable with. Unfortunately, that happens all the time. And I think that is putting a lot of Palestinians in difficult positions. And the last thing I would say in terms of the obviously the challenges when you're in Palestine is obviously the security. So since October, I know a lot of friends and people who are active on social media or media have stopped talking, especially the ones living in Jerusalem under annexation, or the ones in 48. Because you can be, arrested for liking a post now, or, just sharing something. So there is obviously this very real repression of voices. And that also comes with, obviously, a lot of then consequences in terms of self-censorship and just shutting people down, because obviously either their family are at risk, they're either intimidated or arrested, etc. So that obviously, that very real repression exists. And again, we're not all the same in that way. Like, I hold a foreign passport. I know I'm a bit more protected than a Palestinian sitting in a refugee camp in Ramallah, or someone who has a green ID and no permit to go to Jerusalem. Like, these dynamics are also very present here.
Thank you, Ines. So Amy, similar question for you. As a diaspora organization based in the UK, how do you go about navigating the need and the nuance around centering Palestinian voices in your work?
Thank you. I mean, just to reiterate a little what Ines was saying, obviously, we focus a lot on who's on the front line in this issue, sort of who needs to speak to what issue apart from anything else. Sorry, I'm going to speak up a little bit loudly because I think I can't be heard very well. So I will try. I'm not shouting. I'm just trying to make myself heard. But I think, in our work as McCann, as an educational organization that's trying to transform the existing narrative, we're really trying to make sure that we are speaking in a way that speaks to the experience of all Palestinians wherever they are. And that's through delivering educational programs and trainings on Palestine and intersecting struggles, and building kind of resources as well that really tackles the kinds of framings and misinformation that is out there in the mainstream, and some of the issues that Ines has already talked or touched on. So we really recognize the extent to which the freedom of Palestinians is very much intertwined with the freedom of oppressed peoples everywhere, and that we're in this very collective struggle. But the importance of having Palestinians tell their own stories and their family histories, their lives, whether that's through displacement or their lives under a brutal military assault, so that we can shape the conversation about our own struggle, can't really be underestimated. And one of the things that happens a great deal here in Britain is that often either it's a case of, like, if you're going to have a Palestinian speak, then you need to also have that balanced out by an Israeli, but also there's much more interest in Jewish supporters of the Palestinian cause and what they have to say than, for instance, of British Palestinians and their take on the situation. So there's a whole kind of multi-layering that goes on. And to some extent, I mean, in the past, I think there's also been another way of looking at it. I think now, actually, Ines is very right about sort of making sure, or the media wanting to speak specifically to people on the ground. But previously, there have also been cases. I mean, I was born here. I grown up in the education system. I speak with a very English accent. And so there's a sort of also kind of like, well, that's one who might be quite palatable in the way that she's going to talk about Palestine. So there are the kind of assumptions that are made about how you present yourself as well in terms of who gets a platform. Not just what you say, but how you present yourself. So these are all things that we're having to navigate at the moment. And as McCann, we're working as a consciously diaspora-led organization, but we really do take our direction from discussions with Palestinians all over, including within historic Palestine. And we're very proud of our partnerships with our partners in Palestine, so that we can be a vehicle for amplifying their work and analysis also here in Britain, but also kind of in the US and through other kind of online webinars and workshops that we do. And the overwhelming majority of our educators are Palestinian, and we really prioritize Palestinian sources in all of our materials, in our spoken and our written content. And we focus on Palestinian experiences. And often our workshops are either co-led or co-created with Palestinian partners. And that really depends on the subject matter, but many times there are Palestinians on the ground in Palestine. And COVID actually kind of helped us in that, in the sense that it moved us online and brought us much closer together, because people started doing many more of events like this, which meant that we could really communicate in different ways. And we also kind of provide trainings for Palestinian students who are going to be coming to US or UK campuses, who are very well versed in their own history and reality on the ground, but are not necessarily prepared for the kind of hostile environment that's on the Western campuses that they have to face. Having said all of that, just going back to what Ines was saying, again, we're also very aware, and since October, it's been very difficult in running our workshops. We're very aware it's very difficult for our Palestinian colleagues on the ground to either co-lead or co-create workshops with us, either because they're actually sort of dealing with really difficult circumstances, which means it's impossible to have the time to invest into putting together a workshop, but also it means that they could be in real danger, and they have a very different set of risks to the ones that Palestinians in the diaspora face. So we're very mindful of that. Wherever we can, we work together, but we also have their safety as much as possible in our focus.
Thanks, Amy. I just wanted to echo what both speakers have just said. And I think when I think about this genocide in Gaza, the adjective that gets attached to it is live streamed, right? When I think about who's doing the live streaming, it's the people who are enduring genocide, right? And some of those people are journalists, trained as journalists. Most of them are not. Most of them are just everyday people, knowing that they need to document this because either the media won't or they'll do it dishonestly. And I think about so much about speaking truth to power is half of the speaking comes from the act of witnessing. And I think there's always that need to remember that we are witnessing a human being on the other side of that screen. And so I think so much of speaking truth to power is also just realizing that we're amplifying a story that's unfolding before our eyes. So let's shift gears, and I'd like to take a look at the bigger picture of where we're at today, the challenges and gains that we've made as a movement, and how we move forward from here. So Ines, we know this propaganda war is taking place on many fronts, from mainstream traditional media all the way to it being baked into our online algorithms. Can you give us an overview of the various platforms and tactics that spread misinformation and Zionist agendas?
I won't give you the whole mapping of who, because they are a big machine, unfortunately. But let's look a bit at the tactics. I think there is, we need to be able to recognize them. I think to educate people around these. And when I say people, it's not just everyday people, it's obviously the media, even like NGOs, international NGOs, diplomats, thought leaders, just to be able to recognize these disinformation practices. We had done a short sort of post about this playbook, but I think it's interesting to understand the process. So what we're seeing now with the genocide is obviously trying to, place ourselves in a post-truth world where we're lying, right? So that's a major line that they're using now is kind of, you're lying, it's fake, there's no famine, there's no, they are really using those lines and using that propaganda. And so I think trying to constantly delegitimize, question the reality is something that is very strongly present. And I think we shouldn't underestimate it, because we are in an era of AI generated content, of deep fakes and whatever. So they use that card to deny the testimonies and the flood of information and reality that the people are seeing. Now, obviously, this doesn't work that much, but mainly with youth, because we've conducted PIPD with YouGov, a public opinion polling, and what it shows is that youth, the 18-24, don't buy it, but the other generations kind of buy it more in a way that the 18-24 are more on social media. They're directly, seeing the genocide live on their screens, and they get it. But it's still a challenge for older generations and many layers of the population. So I think we shouldn't underestimate that. And they've created a propaganda concept out of it, which is Pallywood, right? So it's the combination between Hollywood and Palestine, which we would kind of exaggerate our reality and we would lie and so on. So that is very important to note. The second part being that the way they would do it when something happens is, first they will blame us, right? They blame us for the violence against us. And that's a general narrative tactic is blaming the victim. It's this kind of fallacy, it's recurring. They're constantly blaming us, from Golda Meir, who was saying that, you shouldn't let us be basically killing your own children. It's not the exact quote, but it's basically blaming us for them killing our children. And it continues today, that we are Hamas victims and all of that propaganda and narrative. So I think that's important to understand, because that's their first way of delegitimizing us and kind of, sort of, again, playing that disinformation. The second thing is obviously that, so we would be responsible or we're lying. We're seeing in multiple cases, we've seen it with El Shifa hospital bombing, we've seen it with Shireen Abu Akleh. It's always the same playbook, right? Blaming us first, kind of, we would be at fault somewhere. It would be our fault, or we would be responsible for it. Then denial, no, we haven't done this, or there was no war crimes, or there was no civilian kind of, and now we're discovering mass graves and then obviously the horrific things that we know. But in the case of Shireen, it was the same. They denied, and then they had to recognize way later when the damage was done, and the entire Western media is falling into the trap and still falling into those traps. They are then retracting, but the damage is done, and the narrative has been set, and then we have to be sort of on kind of a repairing mode or defensive. But a public opinion they have instilled the doubt, and they have instilled the questioning. And so I think it's also for us all to be vigilant and to be constantly repeating again and kind of hammering these methods, because again, many people know about China's disinformation system, about Russia's trolling armies and disinformation system, but somehow Israel is always given the benefit of the doubt, they're always kind of treated as a sort of good faith actor or good faith communicator, which is another problem that we're trying to fight against, is how not to take Israeli army and Israeli officials declarations and facts to the value. But I can tell you they are extremely aggressive in their communication. Like the moment that there is a martyr in Jenin refugee camp, or they will send to all of the journalists out there something saying he was a terrorist and here's the it's very, very the machine is very efficient in a way that they have a lot of means, and they have a lot of like human power, and they have systematic ways of playing that disinformation. So I think we're up against something that's obviously very I think very well sort of organized. And the government works with these what we call gongos, like the sort of government operated sort of NGOs, and they call themselves NGOs, but they're like the lobbies and the different pro-Israel like shops out there, from like obviously the known one from AIPAC to Camera in the UK that is smearing Palestinians, and many of those. So that ecosystem is very wide. They have millions, and again, that sort of propaganda machine is very sort of oiled and functioning in a very systematic way. So I think again, it's about making sure that people understand more and more that they are effectively lying, and that they're bad faith, and that I think we are up against just a colonial entity that is not there to tell the truth, but to defend their colonial agenda. And I think this is what we're trying to do. Not to be on the defensive in terms of, no, I mean, you did it and we're not anti-Semitic and so on, but in terms of trying to undermine that propaganda machine and undermine the functioning, I think, behind it.
Thanks, Ines. No doubt that the machine is well-oiled, well-funded, and persistent. So Amy, I'd like to look at the other side of that question with you. For many of us in the movement, moments of powerlessness, exhaustion, and despair take hold when we face the facts that our advocacy and pressure has not yet brought about a ceasefire, when it feels like the worst has happened in Gaza and somehow the worst is still yet to come. So help us find some hope by giving us perspective on how the narrative has shifted for the better for Palestine. And moving forward, what are the most strategic ways to direct our advocacy and energy to keep us mobilized?
Thank you. Yes. So, I mean, it's very difficult to be hugely optimistic at such a time. But I think in a world in which Palestinians are really relentlessly dehumanized, and the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and dignity is being demonized to the extent that it is, and the advocates are consistently told that they have to get real, that they have to succumb to fatalism or pessimism, and a mindset that really insists that we don't really have a choice, that we have to adapt our hopes and our abilities to the current world order or suffer the consequences. So I think in that context, political education is really key. And in this really horrific historical moment, it's an act that in itself is not only kind of involving ethics, but also civic courage, just in terms of actually educating ourselves and making sure that we're using education to make something happen politically, to transform the way that people are thinking and the social kind of political order. And I was born in the 1970s, and my political awakening really came at the age of 11 in 1982, when Israel at that time was invading Lebanon and laying siege to Beirut for 7 weeks. And trying to drive out the PLO, again, cutting off water, cutting off food, cutting off power, and carrying out massacres. And I would go home, and at school, everything was very normal. And then I'd go home and my father was completely mad with worry, unable to get through to our family, not knowing if they were dead or alive. And it was a horrific time, but eventually, you know, that what happened with the Sabra and Shatila massacres and the testimonies that came out describing that horrific slaughter actually did bring about a major shift in public opinion here in Britain. And for the first time, there were some television images that came out that really shifted public opinion and provided a foundation for the solidarity movement that has continued to grow today through every major conflagration that has happened. The solidarity movement here has really grown, and we can see that the success in terms of the shifting of the narrative and the ways in which people perceive the Palestinian struggle has really come through the extent to which, in the measures that have been taken to try and close down that narrative and try and conflate anti-Semitism and the legitimate criticism of laws and policies and the constitutional order of Israel, that kind of effort to threaten the rights of Palestinians to describe their own experience of oppression and the rights of others to advocate on our behalf as well. We're really familiar with the way in that's been weaponized in recent years. But there's now a return to a different narrative being played out on the international stage as well, that I think can be traced back to a much earlier UN General Assembly resolution back in 1975, which really situated Palestine and the struggle as an anti-colonial, anti-racist movement that was connecting Israel to the racist regimes of Zimbabwe and South Africa, and was calling for an elimination of racial discrimination in all of its forms, as well as the recognition of the dignity of peoples and their right to self-determination. And that was closed down, that resolution. It was repealed really for two reasons. It was the Soviet bloc, which had passed or helped pass the resolution in the first place, had collapsed. And Israel and the US were demanding that it was revoked so that they could participate in the Madrid peace process, the conference. And we know, we've seen how during Oslo, the notion of Palestinian liberation was really reduced to a peace building narrative where talking about the Nakba, talking about the right of return, talking about apartheid all became taboo and was depicted as somehow being extreme. And it's only really recently that the mainstream international human rights organizations have started talking, following the suit of Palestinian human rights organizations who have been calling it apartheid for years, to start kind of bringing that back into the international arena and onto the political stage. And today, although we're seeing the kind of mainstream media and political establishment falling over themselves to try and kind of reject terms like apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide and settler colonialism, nevertheless, I would say the unflagging work of Palestinian civil society over the past decades is bearing fruit. And more people are seeing the 76-year oppression of Palestinians for what it is. And more people are getting mobilized. And we're seeing that the rich history that we've had as Palestinian civil society of forging links with struggles around the world and building meaningful relationships is coming back to the fore. So we've seen the re-emergence in recent years of anti-racist movements around the world, the rise of climate justice politics and other social justice initiatives, taking inspiration from discourses and struggles across the global south, and Palestine is very much a part of that. So we've been part of this movement building with the development of a whole array of collaborative and meaningful alliances with different groups that are working on intersecting issues. And so we've seen this upswell of solidarity amongst the public, with millions of people around the world taking to the streets, shutting down train stations. In some cases, they're resigning from their jobs in protest. They're refusing to load boats with weapons for Israel. you know, this is all part of a long and very hard piece of work that's been done by Palestinian civil society for decades. And it's really essential that we don't falter in this moment. We've got to keep resisting the chilling effect and the hostile policies and practices which keep on trying to close down critical thinking and political education and mobilization, precisely because of the success that's happening amongst all sorts of different sectors of society. So we just need to keep opening up those spaces and creating brave spaces to ensure that those people who really have seen the difference and have shifted in terms of their understanding of the narrative feel confident and have the tools to speak up and speak out and take action and take risks in their own spheres and places of work.
I think that's something that gives me some hope in these times. Are moments like, even though the ICJ ruling didn't have material consequences for Israel, in my lifetime, it was the first time seeing Israel in the defendant's seat and having to listen to their crimes uninterrupted. That was a very cathartic moment, and it was a moment that made me feel like the dam is breaking, that, that there is no going back. But the journey ahead is still daunting and bitter and painful and long. So for sort of this last section of our discussion, I'd love to go into sort of tactics around strategy and framing on how we speak up for Palestine with both of you. So Ines, because of the imbalance in power dynamics, Palestinians and allies are often put in the position of the defensive. For example, famously being asked to condemn Palestinian resistance to gain moral permission to even have a voice on the matter. So what are the traps that we should be aware of to not fall into? And how do we take back power over the narrative and shift to being in the offensive?
I might not go into the messaging actually, but rather into what are the tactics and things to keep in mind. First, I want to say that I'm seeing some questions in the chat or Q&A, so I'll try and kind of address some of them in relation to this point. I think as Amy said, but I do think we need to realize the progress we've made as a movement. That is, again, it's not a unified one. It's a very diverse one. It has a lot of organizations, has a lot of different geographies. But I can tell you, I've been involved, let's say, since 2010, right? And even when I was more of a, kid during the Second Intifada. But when we're seeing now that it wasn't such an information war and propaganda war, and now it is, but also our movement has made so much progress in talking to each other and communicating resources and producing resources for one another, and kind of that exists, and that gives me hope, because these, again, there is so much out there that it's not all centralized. And I think part of the more organized organization, part of our work is also to be able to make sure things are accessible and, kind of in sort of in a network way, and kind of have like an ecosystem that can be of resource to the more broader movement and activists and so on. But we have made progress, and I think part of what now we see is what are the different tactics, so that we're, again, how are we going on the offensive and not defensive. So first, we can't rely only on the digital platforms, social media, because they are based where they are. They are in the US, the algorithms and their management are effectively Zionist and pro-Israel. So we also need to think about, diversifying our tactics, not putting all of our eggs in the same basket. And so there is obviously the offline engagement, the different platforms that are more secure and outside Meta, basically control, or even TikTok. So because the censorship is very, very high. So I think we need to diversify. Whenever you communicate, think about the different tools that you're using, because again, these platforms are not our friends. The second thing is, I think, continue to, the more we are under attack for using, the term genocide and apartheid and river to the sea, I think the more we should double down. And it needs explanation. It needs, obviously, big concepts like ethnic cleansing and the Nakba. They are so central to our struggle, but it's true that sometimes they're difficult to understand for like the everyday people. Who are not, in the Palestinian struggle, or allies who are in there all the time. I do think we need to double down. We need to explain, as you said in the beginning, it's not a question of opinion. They are making this a question of opinion. They are doubting. They're, constantly trying to put us down. But to be honest, when we think about apartheid, I remember like 10 years ago, we couldn't even say it. Like that was a canceling reason. Like, it was really impossible. Like we would be shut down automatically. Now it's way more, accepted. So obviously it's questioned, it's being smeared and so on. But we've kind of put the Israeli and the Zionist narrative on the defensive on this, right? And I think now they didn't see it coming that, Israel would be put on trial by South Africa. The global South also get it. They've been colonized themselves. Some of them have lived a genocide. So I think it's important to be able to not only rely on the West, but also on global South allies, people, solidarity, people who have experienced and know what it is, to also push the West. Now, there is obviously this language channels and echo chambers where a lot of the content in English is not necessarily consumed or produced in the global South, but I think it's, they're being seen. And I think it's where we need to also create precedents, create the narrative shift, create the change, also from those places that can put the US and Europe on notice for their complicity, for the way they speak. It's a long battle, because as you see today now, there is the debate is centered around recognition of Palestine and the two-state solution, which, I think like we're stuck in the past in kind of this Oslo peace process talk that, was that of the 90s. So I think we just need to be ahead of the game, and kind of really, the terms of the question are for us to define, and I think they're being redefined thanks to also our offensive work. So that's that, and I think we need to also go and again, inform and educate people and bring content where people are at. And there are things where we could be, more powerful. It's like in the gaming industry, like video games, series. Now, this is also where obviously there is a lot of obstacles, because we are being denied those platforms. And, for a Palestinian series to get on Netflix, the battle that it is. And I know some of the discussions that happened just to get a Palestinian American on Netflix, and that was a huge victory. But it's also, some Palestinians felt it's still very kind of Palestinian American and very polished, because it's supposed to go mainstream, but it's a major victory in a sense that you got a Palestinian refugee to speak about his stories and things that are so Palestinian on a major platform. So I think we need to really push in that direction and multiply the efforts, I think, in terms of, again, getting more Palestinians, more Palestinian voices everywhere. And I will end by saying that I think we also need to learn as Palestinians to be kinder to each other, right? Because again, we don't have a unified leadership, and we are, I think, orphaned politically right now. And I think we're all trying to, I think we all have kind of same common denominators as a vision in terms of the right to return and the right to be in our homeland and kind of liberating from colonialism. I think we all agree on that. The question is like how, we have like any society, we're diverse, and we shouldn't fall in the trap of the ideal victim. that is asked from us, you know, that you need to be, if you're like, you know, blonde, or if you're like Christian, maybe you're actually more palatable, or you're like more deserving of rights. We shouldn't fall into that trap. We should push every diversity of Palestinians to have a voice, but also be mindful of our own diversity from within, and kind of allow for divergence and differences, because that's is inevitably happening because of the diversity of our opinions and shape of society.
Yeah, I want to reiterate the need for more kindness within our movement. I think that there's a lot of work to do, and I think that we should be holding each other to a high standard of, you know, making sure that we're uplifting the narrative in productive ways, but leaving room for people to learn and grow and evolve along the way. So Amy, while the ongoing genocide in Gaza has injected an urgency into our advocacy, we know that the struggle is not new, and it's not confined to being an anti-war movement. It's an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle that transcends borders. So help us understand why it's important for our advocacy today, even in the context of the urgency of Gaza, to have this connection and framing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen in a lot of the protests that the kind of primary call is for a ceasefire, and that is, of course, kind of like absolutely essential. But it's also kind of much more than that. We need to kind of make sure that people understand the different frameworks that apply to Palestine. So we kind of like really go through and do it in a simple fashion, just sort of to address some of the questions around, you know, do we really need to talk about terms of genocide or apartheid? You know, I think it's very useful to unpack those terms. So what does occupation mean? What does apartheid mean? What does settler colonialism mean? Why are we part of an indigenous decolonization struggle and a global anti-imperialist struggle? And I think one of the very simple, you know, we try at McCann to make things not be sort of really difficult in terms of taking a very academic line. We try and make things, simplify things so people can use them in their advocacy. And I think, you know, we don't all need to be Edward Said in order to be effective advocates. So a very helpful way of thinking about Zionist policy is simply that it's based on the maximum land for the minimum number of Palestinians, and the maximum amount of Palestinians on a minimum amount of land. And that's been its policy from the get-go. So we kind of, and also just to think around how settler colonialism establishes its system of power and is there to really dominate over and exploit everything, including the land, the natural resources, in its framework. But I think that isn't enough either. We can't just sort of think about settler colonialism, because that really limits our understanding of the oppressive structure of Zionism, that divorces it from its regional and global dimensions in terms of our struggle. And so the reason that Zionism and the Israeli state, and we ran a workshop yesterday, my colleagues ran a workshop on precisely this issue. And the reason why Zionism and the Israeli state are dangerous, not just because they're creating a class of settlers who live at the expense of the natives, which is of course exceptionally important, but also because it's part of this global power structure of imperialism. And so that's been affecting freedom in the region more broadly. And in the past and present, it's continuing to try to expand its colony into Lebanon, into Syria, into Egypt. So that kind of means that we start taking a much more regional sort of dimension, looking at the way in which Palestinian liberation, as Ines has just been talking about, is connected with other global struggles or nations that are suffering due to the same forms of imperialism. So if we start understanding the Palestinian struggle in that way, and not just focusing on creating equality, that's, if we just sort of focus on that sort of notion of equality, then we're going to really misunderstand the implications of Zionism in the wider global imperial order. And we have to think about it as basically Western imperialism is an overarching structure that is exploiting the global south, and Palestine is an exemplar of that. And we're seeing it being played out in international law, where the hypocrisy couldn't be writ more large, where we've seen Palestinian attempts to get justice unanswered, and it's very clear that international justice is being used, or has been used in the past, simply as a tool to advance imperial interests rather than justice. So we really have to work together to really push back on that. We need a new world order that really does uphold the principles of freedom, of justice, and it's a future in which the same rules have to apply to everyone, and it isn't weaponized by powerful states against their rivals.
Thank you, Amy. So for our last few minutes together in this webinar, I want to acknowledge that this necessary work comes with risk and sacrifice. For truth tellers in Gaza, their lives are on the line. Over 100 reporters have been killed in Gaza since October, making it the deadliest place in the world to be a journalist. For Palestinians and allies around the world, it comes at the cost of being smeared, maligned, arrested, beaten, banned, and censored. But we need truth-telling. It's vital in bringing about a shift in mass consciousness to bring about an end to this genocide and an end to Israel's military occupation and apartheid regime. So my final question for both panelists, just very briefly, so that we can end on a note that hopefully galvanizes our audience. What is your message to a global audience that may help them find their courage to assume these risks and these sacrifices and fuel the resolve to be truth tellers for Palestine? So that question is open for both or either panelists to take.
Go first, Amy, because I went first all the time.
Oh, well, I mean, I as the genocide continues, it's very difficult not to feel defeated by feelings of desperation, of alienation. And when we're surrounded by people also who may say it's terrible what's happening on the ground and then move on, either because they're frightened that they're going to be smeared or maligned, or because they feel overwhelmed by what we're witnessing. But it's really clear we cannot continue as if everything is normal, and we really owe it to the truth tellers whose lives are actually on the line. As a woman and as a Palestinian, I'm very finely attuned to the charge of being too emotional, and often I'm praised for being really calm, as if that's a sort of standard aspiration that the good or moderate Arab should be kind of aspiring to. But I think, we, in this moment, we also have to reserve our right to be angry. And with anger actually comes hope. And it's a refusal to be forced into fatalistic or cynical indifference. And it's an anger that springs from hope, because I think that there is a knowledge that freedom, choice, decision, possibility, all of those things are only possible because they can be denied and despised and refused. And that's why it's our responsibility to work together collectively to resist the efforts to really immobilize history and maintain a hugely unjust order, and ensure that we've all got the skills and the ability to create the conditions of liberation by the very way in which we work together towards it. And that speaks again to Innes's point that we need to all be much kinder to each other as Palestinians.
Thank you, Amy, and I couldn't agree more. I think I give a lot of briefings and talks and it's exhausting. I think Palestinians are exhausted, and unfortunately we are requested to continue kind of, again, yeah, as you said, speaking in a calm manner, in like a articulated way, when we are all so angry and outraged. And I think it's important to keep pushing that, our right to be angry. I really fully subscribe to that. And I think it's about every ally out there. So, you know, if you are not a Palestinian, think about when you're thinking twice about sharing and posting, etc., about educating around you, think about the Palestinian and what the cost is to speak up. I think that silence is not an option during this genocide. If you are an ally, a true ally, you are taking matters to inform people, to push. Everyone has an influence, whether it's you're in a company that can change the way that they do things, whether you are just, you have a community members or family members who could change things, whether you can just inform around you, whether you have a lot of followers or not, it doesn't matter. There's always a way to act and to speak up. And I think it's about also when you act, do speak up. So if you write to your MP, I don't know, whatever you do, you go to a campus encampment to show solidarity, then you speak up about it. And I think it's important. And what's important is, you know, if you have a doubt, just come to us, come to Build Palestine, to Makan, to PIPD. We have the resources, we have the knowledge to also lead you to the right platforms, tech solutions, whatever information, knowledge, articles, you know, things that can just help you in understanding and educating around you. So I think it's important to do that, to seek that information because it's there, and to really just do speak up, because again, it's tiring for Palestinians to have to constantly having to prove our humanity and to constantly fight this dehumanization and to have to kind of almost like have to argue that we deserve rights as anyone else. And again, you don't need to be an ideal victim to actually just deserve simply to be free. So I think that's my message to whoever is listening to us today. Thank you so much.
I want to thank both Amy and Ines for making the time today to join us. And thank you for the work that you do. We hope this has been insightful, informative, and inspiring for our audience. I also want to invite you all to keep up with the work of Build Palestine. We have been running these Mobilizing for Gaza webinars for a few months now on a monthly basis. And if you go to our website, buildpalestine.com, you can access the recordings from previous sessions. We've covered topics such as mutual aid, linking the genocide in Gaza to the global feminist movement, and also job creation for Palestinians. Next month, we'll be discussing the role of education and how on-the-ground grassroots organizers are providing education for displaced and exiled youth and children of Gaza. Another way to keep up with the work of Build Palestine is to join our membership network, which is called Under the Olive Tree. That's an interactive membership platform. It's a hub for supporters of Palestine to share and plug into initiatives that uplift and advance Palestinian progress. You can learn more and join us by going to buildpalestine.com/join. Thank you again all so much for joining today, and to our speakers. Keep advocating, keep building community, keep taking care of yourselves in these difficult times. Thank you again. Thank you, Amy and Ines. I'm wishing you all the best for the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.